How sweet is the shepherd's sweet lot, from the morn to the evening he strays. He shall follow his sheep all the day, and his tongue shall be filled with praise. For he hears the lamb's innocent call, and he hears the ew's tender reply. He is watchful while they are in peace, for they know when their shepherd is nigh. This little poem, like the others in the collection from which it comes, was engraved and illustrated, as well as written, by the poet William Blake. Its simple theme is typical of his work, partly representing his belief in humanity and his own special view of Christianity and Christ, often depicted as a shepherd. There is no other poet or artist whose work takes literary and painterly forms which are so inextricably intertwined. For his audience, it is a remarkable experience to be able to look at what he saw in his mind as he represents it in his extraordinary pictures. William Blake was born on 28th November 1757 in a house on Broadwick Street in London. The site has been many times built over, but it is in a district of the city called Soho, at that time close to fields and countryside, and a highly respectable and quite fashionable area. His father was a fairly prosperous shopkeeper, a hosier, selling socks, gloves, and trimmings for ladies' clothes. Blake was baptized here at St. James's, Piccadilly, a fine 17th century building by Christopher Wren, the sort of elegance which graced so much of London in Blake's day. The Christian religion and belief in God was very much more a part of life then than it is today, but Blake's family were dissenters, probably Baptists, one of the many groups which over the previous century or so had broken away from the Church of England. The fact that his family were dissenters meant that his religious views were developed in an atmosphere of inspiration, excitement, and revelation, which contrasted with the beliefs of the established church, a much more sober and, in its own eyes, more reasonable form of religion. He was not sent to school, which meant that he escaped the rigorous religious instruction he would certainly have met there. He was free to be a child of nature. He wrote, "Thank God I was never sent to school, to be flogged into following the style of a fool." He was, obviously, even at such an early age, able to develop the freedom of outlook which was to characterize all his work. Of course he learned to read and write, taught by his mother. He soon appears to have quickly passed most children of his age in his understanding and in the breadth of his reading. The first formal education he received was at Parr's drawing school in the Strand. He drew from his earliest years. He drew what he saw around him, copied prints, went to art collections. He even bought cheap prints at local auctions, and came to distinguish one artist's work from another. It's not surprising to find that he favored the work of the German artist Dürer, a master of line drawing and engraving, and a man very free in his ideas and view of life. Blake had to have a trade in order to live, so he was apprenticed to a man called James Bazier, who had an engraving workshop at 31 Great Queen Street, about 15 minutes' walk from Blake's home. Here the boy learned to use the various tools of the trade. Engraving was an important and well-paid job, since it was the only way illustrations and paintings could be mass-produced in the books of the time. Still, it was only considered to be a craft and not an art. The engraver simply copied the work of the artist. For a creative man like Blake, it was always to be irksome that he could only make a living by copying the work of others, whom he generally considered as having inferior talents to his own. Blake's apprenticeship lasted 7 years, from 1772 to 1779. He was a good apprentice, and his remarkable skill was soon recognized. This was one of his earliest works. Every line had to be cut into the copper plates, so it was a tedious and difficult task. The engraver also had to know all about the various ways of etching the plates with acid and producing the prints. However, artists and cultivated men frequented Bezier's workshop, so it's likely that Blake's reading and intellectual development didn't stand still at this time. He was an extremely well-read man. In his youth, he later recorded that he read the Bible, of course, Milton, Shakespeare, the philosophers Burke, Bacon, and the great classical writers in Latin, Greek, and French and Italian. For a self-educated man, he was immensely knowledgeable. He owned in particular a book called Reflections on the Painting and Sculpture of the Greeks, which praised the beauty of the naked human form, and Blake's early enthusiasm for nudes lasted throughout his life. For him, it was as if the nude figures of the men, women, and children he made were the ultimate and most beautiful way by which he could express the intensity of his feeling. From his earliest years, Blake seems to have been driven to a level of inspired expression achieved by few men. In poetry, his inspiration began around 10 years of age, and he appears to have been continually writing poems over the ensuing years of his apprenticeship. When that ended in 1779, he enrolled as a student at the Royal Academy schools. The training was free, and by 1780 he had a work in the annual summer exhibition held at Somerset House, and was producing historical painting and watercolours, like this one about English captives on sale to Pope Gregory in Rome. He had two good friends at this time. The artist Thomas Stothard became very popular as an illustrator of books, and for more than 20 years he and Blake were friends. Blake engraved many of his drawings. Another artist friend was John Flaxman, who did many of the classical designs for the popular Wedgwood pottery. These two introduced Blake to cultured society and persuaded a group of people to pay for the publication of Blake's early poems, about which they were all very enthusiastic, under the title of Poetical Sketches. Only 50 copies were printed, but it was a measure of the esteem in which they held Blake and his work. The poems covered a period of 10 or 15 years, up to the age of 26, and reflect the wide reading and the many literary influences which played upon him. In 1780, there took place what were called the Gordon Riots. In Blake's own home street of Broad Street, or Broadwick Street as it's now known, violent riots, burnings and disturbances took place as part of anti-Catholic feelings stirred up by the Scottish Lord Gordon. Blake seems to have taken part in these riots, which eventually meant the prison of Newgate being attacked and the prisoners set at liberty. This political activity, or expression of a political standpoint, was very important in Blake's life. He was very anti-government or anti-authority. He was against kings and for the American colonies and the French Revolution. He remained so all his life. Indeed, so strong were his feelings on these subjects, it was probably lucky for him that people didn't largely understand what he wrote or painted, or he might have very well gone to prison. Catherine Butcher and his marriage to her was the next big step in Blake's life. He met her while recovering from a refusal from another girl. They took to each other at first sight, and Catherine, the daughter of a market gardener at Battersea, was to make a wonderful companion and wife for Blake over the years of poverty and struggle that were to follow for the poet and artist who remained largely unnoticed by the people of his day. In August 1782, when Blake was 24 and Catherine 20, St. Mary's Church, situated on the south bank of the River Thames, a lovely church in the classical style, was the scene of Blake's wedding to Catherine. She was illiterate, as most girls of her class would be, so Blake taught her to write and to help him in the various tasks of engraving. Every account we have of their life together suggests that the marriage, begun in this church, though it produced no children for them, brought continuing happiness and comfort to Blake for the rest of his life. Engraving was to be the mainstay of their life, and it was not long after his marriage that he began to play with the idea of engraving his poems instead of having them printed, and not only engraving the words, but illuminating them with his own designs and drawings. In this way he was very economically able to produce copies of his poetry, and at the same time to give them the special embellishment of his visual imagination. Important in this practical development, and in his development too as a poetic visionary, was the death of his beloved younger brother Robert. Robert was 10 years his junior, and Blake had trained him as an artist. This remarkable nude drawing, Blake did not often draw from life, is probably of Robert. Robert died in 1787, aged 19, and his death had a great effect on the poet. Firstly, he said that Robert had suggested the technique of engraving his poems, but, more important, Robert was the inspiration of many of the poems themselves. It was as if he spoke to Blake from the grave. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, "Pipe a song about a lamb." So I piped with merry cheer. "Piper, pipe that song again." So I piped. He wept to hear. "Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer." So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. "Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read." So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed, and I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs, every child may joy to hear. This is the first poem in Blake's collection, Songs of Innocence, which he published in his new fashion of engraving in 1789. It seems to explain the simple freedom of Blake's view of life, and certainly the poems, amongst the finest and most generally known and valued that he wrote, seem to work in a simple and uncomplicated way. But uncomplicated Blake certainly was not. 1789 was also the year of the French Revolution. For Blake it was also a glorious upsurge of the enslaved poor against the oppressive nobility. He wrote Tyriel, the first of his mythological poems, or prophetic books as he called them. For him, prophecy meant a revelation of eternal truths. In this case it was that slavery, spiritual slavery, artistic, political, social slavery, were all to be condemned. He was dissatisfied with Tyriel and didn't publish it, but in its symbolism it already contains the seeds of greater things to come. The Songs of Innocence, in their lightness and delicacy, contrast remarkably with the seriousness of purpose in what are called his prophetic books. It is through the Songs of Innocence and other similar poems that Blake has remained best known and best loved. Even here, of course, Blake's thought and expression of his thought is complex. In The Little Black Boy, he tackles head-on the question of colour. My mother bore me in the southern wild, and I am black, but oh, my soul is white. White as an angel is the English child, but I am black, as if bereaved of light. My mother taught me underneath a tree, and sitting down before the heat of day, she took me on her lap and kissed me, and pointing to the east began to say, "Look on the rising sun, there God does live, and gives his light, and gives his heat away, and flowers and trees and beasts and men receive comfort in morning, joy in the noonday. And we are put on earth a little space, that we may learn to bear the beams of love. And these black bodies and this sunburnt face is but a cloud, and like a shady grove. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, the cloud will vanish. We shall hear his voice saying, 'Come out from the grove, my love and care, and round my golden tent like lambs rejoice.' Thus did my mother say, and kissed me, and thus I say to little English boy, when I from black and he from white cloud free, and round the tent of God like lambs we joy, I'll shade him from the heat, till he can bear to lean in joy upon our Father's knee. And then I'll stand and stroke his silver hair, and be like him, and he will then love me." The poems were hand-coloured by Blake and his wife, so in the different versions that exist, the colours vary. In some versions, only the lines are coloured. In other words, he printed with coloured inks. Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish scientist and mystic, was at this time a considerable influence on Blake. He and Catherine signed a paper, along with others, declaring their faith in the particular form of religion revealed to Swedenborg in his studies. The sort of thing that appealed to Blake was the assertion that all churches could share the same beliefs, that we should all only worship Jesus Christ, that married love is better than any other, that when we die our body rises again in our spiritual bodies, the perfect human form. Again and again in Blake's paintings we see his vision of the perfect human form. In his poetry, although he is much concerned with spiritual values, his view of the human spirit and spirituality was quite different from that of the more conventional religions of the day. He could not fully subscribe to any religion for any length of time, so he was to drop many of Swedenborg's teachings before long. In 1790, the Blakes moved to this house in Hercules Road in Lambeth. They had lived until then in Soho, where Blake was born, but Lambeth was to be the most comfortable 10 years of their lives. The house had plenty of light, airy rooms and a garden. It was near Lambeth Palace and the Thames, in an area much more agreeable then than it is now. Remnants of houses of the period remain, as do the buildings of the Charity School. Here Blake began The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which was to be another of his illuminated poems. It is a satire on Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell, and a renunciation of Blake's commitment to Swedenborg's teachings. His techniques of engraving his poems were now thoroughly developed, as were his methods of propounding his social and political ideas. The last section, The Song of Liberty, is a theme dear to Blake's heart, a celebration of the liberty of the recently independent American colonies and of people fighting for freedom everywhere and in every way. In Lambeth, too, he produced the Songs of Experience, a companion volume to the Songs of Innocence, amongst them perhaps the most famous of all his poems. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain? In what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil? What dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? when the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? Once again each poem was engraved and accompanied by its own illustrations and designs, and as with all Blake's work, the two books form a complex comment on good and evil, the two contrary states of the human soul. He printed and coloured these poems until the end of his life, as customers came along and asked for them. For Blake, the fall of man is experienced by all of us when we pass at adolescence from the stage of innocence to the stage of experience. So Adam and Eve, who feature on the opening plate, represent everyone. All human beings, thrust out into the river of life when we come of age, reach the stage of knowing ourselves and understanding about evil. Blake says in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. And in the Songs of Innocence and Experience he rehearses the ideas of opposites. Like all great works of art, they have a complex life of their own and work for audiences on many levels. Certainly these poems cannot be seen as any less than profound and disquieting. Blake's life meanwhile continued as not much less of a struggle than before. As he hardly sold his poems or his paintings, he continued his work as an engraver. These prints show his immense skill. They're from a book about life in Suriname by a man called Stedman, who was revolted by the cruelty meted out by the white man to the natives. In his book, he was determined that people should understand these brutalities. Blake engraved his drawings, and the two became friends. During the Lambeth period, he produced other prophetic books. America, the story of the American Revolution, seen by Blake as a cosmic outburst of energy. The character Orc inflames the Americans to rebel against England. He followed this up with Europe, which is concerned with Europe before the cataclysms of Blake's time, the American and the French revolutions. The dramatic picture of Urizen creating the universe was the frontispiece to this poem. The compasses in his hand are imposing a rational order on the material world. From about 1790, Thomas Butts, a clerk in government service, was a most important friend and patron of Blake's. Butts steadily bought Blake's poems and paintings, and with his wife and family became a good friend to the Blakes. In 1799, Butts even commissioned Blake to paint a series of pictures on themes from the Bible. By 1800, however, Blake's most successful period as an engraver was ending, and when an offer of work from a new patron, William Haley, came along, he took it. Haley was a rather egocentric man, more interested in getting Blake to do what he wanted than fostering Blake's own creative talents. The Blakes rented this cottage at Felpham on the Sussex coast, and here Blake worked at Haley's projects. These included a series of engravings of English poets to decorate Haley's library, but they also included many illustrations of Milton, an edition of whose work Haley was preparing with Blake's help. The immersion in Milton's work that this produced had a profound effect on Blake. While Haley represented the outside world and its fear of the imagination, Milton freed him, and by the time he left Felpham 3 years later, he was ready to begin the last great period of his life's work. An absurd incident took place at Felpham, which illustrates Blake's strength, both physical and in character. One day he found a soldier called Schofield apparently loitering in his garden, and asked him to leave. When Schofield refused, Blake forced him physically into the street and down the road to the Fox, where he with difficulty got him to stop inside the pub. To Blake's horror, he was charged with assault on Schofield, arrested and taken to court. After much trouble, Haley and the quiet people of Felpham testified to Blake's good character, and he was acquitted. Perhaps with his strongly held views on life, Blake was lucky that he didn't have more trouble with the law. He began his prophetic work, Jerusalem, in 1804. It was to occupy him for about 20 years. As a spiritual history of man, both in poetry and in the wonderful illustrations, it was to be his greatest work, and given that his material circumstances worsened throughout this time, it was a vast undertaking. It was a synthesis of all his previous ideas, and uses the mythology that he'd built up in his earlier works. Blake produced this astounding painting of a poet in the innermost shrine of his imagination, writing to an angel's dictation. We have to assume that this is how Blake saw his own creative process, where he was a channel for the voice of angels, his brother Robert perhaps, or other voices that seemed to people his head and express themselves in his poems and paintings. On their return from Felpham, Blake and his wife lived for about 17 years in South Moulton Street. Apart from his poetry, he was of course producing original paintings and attempting to exhibit and sell them. He was not successful, though in, for example, his illustrations to Paradise Lost by Milton, he produced some of his finest work. Such contemporary criticism as remains is often disparaging. Leigh Hunt called him, along with Wordsworth and others, a quack. He had very few supporters, and even Haley began to commission engravings from others, whom he thought just as good and less expensive than Blake. In 1809, Blake put on an exhibition in his brother James's home in Soho, to which hardly anyone came. In a review in the Examiner, a critic, Robert Hunt, called Blake an unfortunate lunatic whose personal inoffensiveness secures him from confinement. Even his old friends Flaxman and Stoddart seemed to be turning against him. Yet the poet Coleridge found the songs of innocence and experience to be the work of a genius, and there was always his old friend Butts to buy what he produced. In 1818, another old friend introduced him to a young artist, John Linnell, 26 years old. Blake and he soon became friends. Linnell's contemporaries and his teacher Varley also became Blake's admirers and supporters, and their help and friendship was to charmingly colour the last 10 years of Blake's life. Here he chats with Varley. The help of this group of younger men included arranging commissions for a new series of engravings on the biblical story of Job. They also persuaded the Royal Academy in 1822 to pay Blake £25 in recognition of his worth and understanding of his poverty. It was his only official recognition. Blake visited the Linnells at their home in Hampstead, and his connection with this group was a great pleasure to him. They included the young Samuel Palmer, who saw Blake's home as hallowed ground. The Blakes had moved to Fountain Court off the Strand, and Blake would work at his engraving table by the window in rooms that, according to Palmer, were clean and orderly. Everything was in its place. Catherine Blake was to benefit particularly from their young friends. One of them, Frederick Tatum, 19 when he first met Blake, and a future painter and sculptor, looked after Catherine in her old age. Blake died with only Catherine and his young friends around him on August the 12th, 1826, and he was buried quietly in the Dissenters' graveyard of Bunhill Fields, not far from his home.
Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me spear or clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from men to fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and plain.